Abhishek, thank you so much for coming, for joining. I think the curiosity is very big, so I try to speak as little as possible. If I hear that you kind of found your way into the art already since high school, what was the strength to go on year after year?
Well, it was a happy accident, Thomas, how I got interested in art. Um, when you're a kid in school and in a boarding school, it was actually a funny incident. And um, we were allowed to go out into town only twice a month to go and catch a movie or have a bite. And if you were caught going out more, you could be expelled. So we had to find a legitimate way to get out into town. And I used to see these bunch of guys who used to walk out of the main gate in the middle of the day with their head held high, and we had to slink away in the middle of the night to do what they were doing. And on deeper inquiry, we discovered that they were going to the printer, and the printer was printing the Doon School Weekly. So I said, we must have a magazine to print and get to the printer as well. And the only subject the school didn't have a magazine on was art. So we proposed this to our headmaster, and he gladly agreed. Only when we discussed as to how often this magazine should come out, and frankly speaking, we knew nothing about art. So I said, I think we should start with an annual issue. And he said, annual? But we don't do any magazine only once a year. We do it at least 4 times a year or once a term. And I said, let's start with an annual, and then we can always increase it. And trips to the printer started. We for 6 months, we didn't know where the printer was until we had to deliver the magazine. And that's when the discovery with art began.
So no family background, nobody who really threw you into the art history of India?
Well, I must say I grew up in a home which had a lot of art, and my parents were collectors. But I think it was really hunger and boarding school that pushed me more in that direction.
And what gave you the experience then? And did this magazine was it ever published?
It was published, but what happened was when there was very little time left and we had to produce a magazine, I said, let's write to the 10 great artists of India and ask them to contribute something for the magazine. And, my friends in school laughed. They said, but why would these artists even be interested in what you're doing? I said, it's the first time a school is doing an art magazine, so they should obviously be interested in supporting this. So we wrote to the 10 artists that we thought would be good to include, and only one of them wrote back, and I became pretty much the laughing stock of school until there was 10 days left for the magazine to be printed, to be released, and almost the entire magazine was set with the printer. There was 1 page left, and we got back 9 replies from the artists. We didn't have place to write about what they had done, but we had 1 page to write the thank yous. And we pinned it all up behind the backdrop for where the magazine was going to be launched. And in the holidays that followed, I actually went and met each of these artists to thank them for having taken me seriously. And that began as the relationship with the artists and my collecting journey.
But already, having the idea of meeting or interviewing the 10 most important artists of India give me the idea that you have a certain strength. You have not only a high intelligence, but you are good at defining the goal.
Well, I would accept that, but I wouldn't say that on my own.
Well, how many years happened that you really wanted to found what you have been founding, a museum of 18,000 works, a museum that will open a huge building, a museum that has the ambition to be, I think, the #1 in India, a museum that wants to define inclusion by having many, many departments. MoMA in 29 in New York had, I think, 4 departments. You have 6 departments. So there is a lot of strength behind it, right?
The thing is, Thomas, India has a 10,000-year-old history and culture, but we are quite lacking in our museum culture. The museum going culture in India doesn't exist. I was quite surprised. In the government realm, we have close to 1,000 museums. But the joke in India is you have some of the most crowded cities in the world and some of the most under-visited museums. So if you want to get away from people in India, you go to an Indian museum. And I don't think you'll ever need to wait in queue. And it's almost impossible to get to an international museum when you're traveling and not have to wait for at least half an hour, 45 minutes before you enter. It's not that we don't have great art. We've got amazing art, but I don't think the focus on making the experience and education and making it fun is not part of the agenda. Maybe partly because India has had more important things to do. When basic healthcare and education and access to even clean drinking water has been an issue, I think art and culture comes a little later in the evolution. But I think now is the right time. These things don't happen necessarily sequentially, they need to happen parallelly.
Can you say a little bit about this? To me, it looks like a steep learning curve. Can you say a little bit about your learning curve? Did you study art history then? Did you have other collectors that guided you, or how did it all happen?
So I have no experience with art. I have no education in the arts whatsoever. I just have a deep interest and passion.
Yes.
And like I mentioned, these 8-10 artists who came into my life just because I wrote to them. Similarly, in every department, I've been very fortunate to get some of India's greatest gurus. And the point is that they all had the time because there were very few people interested in the subject. And I was this 15, 16, 17-year-old who would go to them, and I was like a sponge. I would just keep absorbing and learning. And before one knew it, one started collecting. And these were not expensive at all. And because there were such few collectors, the best stuff was still around. And before we knew it, the collection started growing. Museums and curators from around the world would come and see the stuff. They would borrow it for exhibitions, but nobody would borrow it in India. And as if it was not important in India. And then some museums started asking me, so Mr. Poddar, what are you going to do with the collection finally? And I said, I'll go to a museum. And they said, which museum? I said, I don't know. And then they said, would you give it to us? And I said, if you open a branch in India, I'll give it to you. But nobody was prepared to open a branch in India. And somehow I didn't find that any Indian museum would do justice to the collection. It's just because the experience was so lackluster. And speaking to various other collectors, and most of these collectors were at least 30, 40, in some cases 50 years older than me. And in their 70s and early 80s, they would say, we want to do a museum. I said, but why didn't you do it 30 years earlier when you had more energy and more time? And that's when I decided that if I'm going to do a museum, I'll do it when I can enjoy my museum rather than waiting just for a home for the museum. So I think the seeds started sprouting about 15, 20 years ago, but I did nothing very much about it until about 6, 7 years ago.
And the 6, 7 years ago, was that really a time of decision making in a way that you thought it over and over and over, like every night, every other day, whether you should do it or whether you can do it?
So again, this was the state government of Karnataka, the state that I come from. One of the ministers approached me and he said, Abhishek, you're so interested in art, why don't we do a museum together? And I said, when you say together, what do you mean? So he said, no, we clearly don't understand art, but since you're so interested, we'll help you do that. And I said, what would that help mean? He said, we can give you a piece of land and the building. I said, but you'll give me a land on the outskirts of the city, and that won't make sense unless we do it in the center of town. So I said, which building would you give me? He said, you name whichever building you want, and we'll give it to you. And then immediately he said, no, knowing you, you'll ask for buildings that I can't give you. So besides these 7 buildings, you name any building. And so I said, would you give me the museum? And he said, you can have it.
Mhm.
So I said, please make a policy, because today your party is in power, tomorrow you would not be. And then what happens? So they actually made a policy, and they offered about 37, 38 properties from across the state up for adoption as a public-private participation. And 8 people came forward to adopt them, and we were one, and in which there were the 3 main museums in the city. So all these were signed, but it was a short-lived love affair. In India, unfortunately, the perception is that when government and private enterprise get together, it's generally a recipe for a scam. And many people thought that this is a backdoor entry into grabbing the land or something. So we put out the agreement that we had signed, and I said, all the money is coming from me, and this is only for 5 years. So there can't be a stupider land grab scheme. But I think the public perception for all these were not really in favor. So we then decided to do it on our own. And all 8 fizzled out. Mm-hmm. And I think ours is the only project that is going ahead, but not as a PPP. And the fact is, we are ending up building it right across the land from where the government was giving it to us. It's much bigger, much more ambitious, and I don't have myself in shackles dealing with the government.
Well, this is a story. I mean, we could look at other countries, even Switzerland. You know, some of the private collections here have been turned into museums because the museums were kind of slow, or said, okay, we take the whole collection, but of course, half or 3/4 go into storage right away. But your story sounds very unique, because it is as if for the whole Western world, and maybe even for China or other countries, it sounds as if out of respect for the public, you want to be private. Can we put it this way? I mean, you try to create a public museum, although you act entirely as a private person. What gives you the idea to be, let's say, so ambitiously generous?
Well, Thomas, I think many people have tried to take their collection with them, but nobody succeeded so far. And I don't think I would be the first. Mm-hmm. And I think the way you collect and the way you visualize life in your 30s and 40s is very different from your 50s. And it may be an age thing, but I have had so much joy from the collection that it's time to share it with everyone. Mm. And it's so much that it's not fair for one family only to enjoy. Mm-hmm. And today it's become a movement. I mean, the reason the family decided not to have their name involved with it is because we wanted everyone to feel it is their museum. Mm-hmm. And in India, corporate support for art and culture is almost non-existent. Mm-hmm. In fact, just an interesting statistic, but India's budget for art, culture, and heritage as a country, which is 1,000 museums, about 3,500 archaeological sites, and you know how many India has, all our cultural festivals, everything to do with art, music, theater, dance, literature, archaeology, put together as a country, is equal to the budget of the Metropolitan Museum alone.
Okay.
So a country the size of India, and of course, it's possibly the best museum in the world, but one museum on one side and the entire country on the other.
And it is not a small country.
Yeah.
Of the departments, you have, as I said already, 6 different departments. Which collection part was the beginning for you? The family collection?
No, in fact, this is not the family collection. The family collection is not part of MAP. It's the collection that I started when I was in high school, but it was really modern and contemporary. That was the beginning.
And if one says 18,000 pieces, how much of them are modern and contemporary?
The 18,000 isn't the collection that the family gave. The family put in 7,000 to start with.
Mhm.
18,000 is what it's grown to because other people have come and gifted their collections. I would say the largest collection would be photography and possibly popular culture. Um, I won't have an exact number of the breakup of each one, but photography, I mean, 18,000 has been crossed long back. It's become a lot larger now.
Fine. Would you like to talk a little bit about the departments? What made you decide that you need this department, this department, this department? It is like being very comprehensive, obviously, but you want to create high art. I mean, in the West, you say high art and low art, although we hate the difference, kind of, right? But what leads your path? What shaped your path into this?
So there were two reasons that we did these 6 departments. Partly it's because these were the 6 departments that the family collected.
Oh.
And it was really to break the hierarchy between high art and low art. If you look at most museums in India, it's either classical or historical art, or it's modern and contemporary art. Barely anything else fits into that. And the museums in India cater to a very, very small percentage of people. It would be the collectors, the academics, the critics, the students. All told, it would be 2, 3, 4% of the population. If we are trying to build a museum going culture, I can't do that when I'm only addressing a small fraction of the percentage. I need to speak to the people to whom the museum is not a normal place that they would go to. So how do I tell their stories and how do I make it interesting for them? Unless I can put in things that they would relate to in their everyday lives. And that's why folk and tribal art, textile craft and design, photography and popular culture also fits in along with classical art and modern and contemporary. And so much of India is still in its villages. Our craft traditions, our textile traditions are so rich, and yet most of our museums don't show it.
If you look into the future and let's say the building has been opened already and it is maybe 22, what are the ideas? How many people would you expect, the visitor number? And if you even offer education from the beginning, you think it can be like a, as we say, success machine that more and more people come? And could you even have all these audiences?
So what we did, Thomas, is we started our education even before we started construction. So we rented space next door to where we were constructing, and we set up our conservation lab, our education lab, and our technology lab. And we started inviting kids in there. So lots of schools from Bangalore. I mean, we must have had over 6,000 kids who already come in. And we would set up an exhibition for the kids to have a look at and interact with. And we would do workshops there. And it wasn't about teaching them how to draw or paint, but how we could teach them about life through art or their own subjects through art. I'll give you an example. This was one of the first shows we did. And these were kids from about 6 to 13. So we said, how do we get kids interested in art? What can we do to bring them in? So we said, let's do a show on animals. And animals is an easy way to get kids. So we called it Tales and Tales. So ILS and LES. So we had from painting and sculpture and classical art and photography and all original works, about 40 of them. And I was there for about 2-3 classes that came in. This bunch of 25-30 kids would come in, 7, 8, 9-year-olds, and they would be running around it. They would want to touch it. They would say, but this artist doesn't know how to paint a cow. A cow doesn't look like this. And how can, you know, because they can only imagine stuff as it is in real. So after they've made fun of everything and they've settled down, we said, let's play a game. So we gave everybody a map, a rudimentary map of Bangalore. And we said, which are the places these kids would normally go to and who are the people they would meet? So for example, it would be the park where they would find an ice cream vendor or a balloon seller. On the road, they would see a bus conductor or a taxi driver. In their school, their friends, the headmaster, the librarian. At home, their grandmother, a younger brother or sister or somebody like that. So 10 people and 10 places are marked on the map, and each one is asked to go back to the exhibition and match each person with an animal and tell us why they have chosen that. Now, there are no right or wrong answers. And invariably, the librarian was the owl. Wow. So is that a preconceived notion that we have? The friend was a dog. So you imagine, is it that you're looking at the traits that, and the grandmother was the cow, but in one case, the grandmother was a fox. Yes. So when we asked that, why is your grandmother the fox? We discovered the frosty relationship that grandmother and grandchild had in that case. And it became really interesting because all the kids were discussing between themselves, and they are friends because they're from the same school. Yeah. Then the other exercise we did was, we said, you've got to make your own animal. You've got to invent your animal. And they said, but how can we invent an animal? So we said, in India, you can invent your God. How difficult is it to make an animal? And they couldn't understand that. So we printed out 10 of the works that we had, and we cut the head separately, the body separately, and the tail separately. And we said a simple way is you mix and match. So they would take, like we have Ganesh, which is the head of an elephant and the body of a man, or Garud, which is again a bird and that. So we said our gods are like that. You can make any animal you want. So somebody took the body of a tiger, the head of an elephant, the tail of a peacock. So we said, now name your animal and tell us where you would find the animal and what does this animal do. And the stories these kids came up was amazing. And their parents came back and said, what did you do to our kids? They want to go back to school. They want to learn more. So it was things like this. And then one of the schools is saying, this is all good fun for them, but what are they learning? You have to teach them something that is in their curriculum, because otherwise we are wasting their time. So we said, okay, show us what's in their curriculum. And Thomas, we did a history class with the coin collection. And it was dynasties and stuff, and they have never imbibed history as well as they did there. So we are experimenting as we are going along, but we are making it fun for them.
Wow. I think we are all amazed, Abhishek. And it's only like another 5 minutes or so. Let me ask you 3 more questions. The one is, how can you afford the funding for the museum? How is it possible? Because I would not only ask what the funding is and the amount is per year, but I think the ambition you have is so comprehensive. It's so great. It's so wonderful. You should have maybe unlimited funding.
I wish that was the case. And I hope one day that would happen. But we have still not raised our endowment. In fact, we were on our way to raise it last year, but COVID hasn't helped. The good part is some very important corporates and people from India and across the world have shown interest, and they're supporting this. Funnily, most of them have not necessarily supported the arts before, because India really didn't have too many opportunities to do that. So companies like Wipro and Infosys and Citi and the Tatas, FedEx, Fidelity, Ford Foundation. So there are many who are supporting it, but it's still a lot more that we would require. The family put in 50% of what was required initially. We got founding patrons to come in. We are offering by invitation that you can join as a founder with a financial commitment of support. I always believe if you're doing something and if it's right, just continue doing it and it'll come. We have one of our supporters right here in the audience.
Would you tell us the endowment amount, the ideal amount of the endowment, or is it?
It's not a very ambitious amount. The total budget is about 250 crores, which roughly translated would be about $40-45 million.
That's, I would say, modest
Yeah, it is,
for an ambition.
but this is including the land and the building and the endowment.
Yes.
It'll come. There's a God up there who's always had his hand on my head.
So question 2 out of the 3, you have to have an incredible team, right? Just these teachers, let's say, teasing the kids to do all these thinking lessons, so to say, and all these experiments. How do you recruit the team?
We have an
find
incredible team. So I'll tell you what is brilliant about MAP is not just our team, but even our governance and our advisory board. And Rolf is part of that. And he has been an incredible help. And, you know, the wisdom we've got from the people who have told us what to do, because I don't have this background at all. And we are learning as we are going along. Our team is about 65 people at MAP already. And they are some of the best minds and very hardworking and very young. And the good part is they're not afraid to experiment. And I think that's what makes it a fun place to work.
Fine. The spirits are all there. So I think, like every museum on the planet, you probably get a lot of offers, or you even get a lot of demands what you should buy today, tomorrow, next week, next month. And I assume there has to be a decision-making policy. How do you make decisions?
It's very easy right now. We don't have the money to buy anything.
Okay.
So until we can get our acquisition budget,
yes,
whoever offers us something, we try and get them to donate it instead of sell it to us. And if we are not able to convince them, very often we have been able to convince them, then we say that when we have the funds, then come to us or help us get the money or find us somebody who would donate it to us. Sometimes they do that as well.
But do you then also have the quality standards? I mean, I could maybe come with 150 works of art that are really all bad. Would you take them?
No. Unless you give us so much money that we can't say no.
Okay. Well, I think, Abhishek, this is a very exciting story because, if I may say this from the Western point of view, it has been all separate, right? There was the prehistoric museum, there was the modern museum, there was the contemporary museum, there was the so-called Kunsthalle that by tradition more or less had no collection. And then if a private collector or even art dealer, like everybody knows him, Ernst Beyeler in Switzerland, when he had the idea of donating his collection to the museum, they said, well, all these pieces from Africa and Polynesia, they have to go to the folk art museum, which was hurting him badly. And the idea of inclusion in this world, in our world, even the idea of diversity is pretty much a brand new idea. It came in like after the year 2000, more or less. So it looks as if, you know, the intelligence without money, also you're extremely almost too modest, I would say, and the idea of learning like a sponge, what you said, I think this is a nice recipe for all of us.
You know, what has really, what the pandemic has taught us, Thomas, is something that we didn't even know. So my chief technology officer used to joke he had his room in the basement of the office, and now he's got the corner office, because we actually delivered a digital museum, which we had no plans of doing. And we kept our word when we had announced to Bangalore that we would open on the 5th of December last year. Even though the building is not yet ready, we launched the digital museum. And the funny part is our auditorium would have seated about 125, 30 people. So that's the number of people who would have watched our physical opening had we done that. But because we did a digital opening, we were watched by 70,000 people. And effectively, ever since we opened that, we have been doing events regularly. The month of October, we have 9 events. We do a master class once a month. We have speakers from around the globe. We have exhibitions that we do, and these are digital exhibitions, so there's a fair amount of interactivity. And we realized that even after we open the physical museum, the digital museum would still exist. So they're going to be hand in hand.